From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's ahead. In his weekly grain market segment, K-State's Dan O'Brien shares his estimate of the corn price impact from the U.S.-China trade dispute in consideration of any forthcoming government trade aid for you producers. And Dan offers his latest corn price probability forecast based on the latest supply and demand report and new crop planting complications. That'll take us into a visit with K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti on that very score. He'll discuss ongoing issues with corn and soybean planting and stand establishment, and he'll offer some things for you growers to think about as you might consider replanting flooded out fields. Later on Kansas Agricultural Weather, K-State's Mary Knapp, plus more right here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Welcome. Grain market analysis and comment first up today, featuring Dan O'Brien, grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension, and the accent this time around is fully on the corn trade and what's affecting that, Dan. And what we want to do initially here is take from some information that you've pulled together by request on how the China-U.S. trade dispute might well relate to any sort of trade aid that would be coming corn producers' way. This is tied back to last year when there was a discrepancy in that aid between corn and soybeans. So we'll let you take the story from there.
Sure, and I'm not the only one in KSU Ag Econ that has ability to make a contribution on this. Again, Nathan Hendricks, Joe Jansen, all of us and others have a hand in this and are given thought to it. There are published studies that have indicated that the impact of U.S.-China trade negotiations on the market overall for corn, what they're stating varies on who you're talking about. There's a study out of Iowa State talking about corn prices have likely decreased 4 to 6%, or about 13 to 21 cents a bushel. Study out of Illinois, looking at 2018, saying that we were looking at impacts of more like 8 cents a bushel, both those to the downside. So those numbers are certainly more than had come out of the last MFP round of a 1 cent per bushel. I guess in coming forward now into 2019 and looking how basically since December of last year what the pattern in corn markets had been, or at least until this week when planting concerns became such a major issue. Again, when you look back and see what was happening in those markets, basically from December on, coming out of harvest, they went sideways. And really forsook any type of a seasonal price increase that we've typically seen in at least Kansas grain markets over the last 17, 18 years. So when you line up the seasonal patterns we'd expect to see with what we actually had coming out of, again, October, November, and then get to December and go forward, you're looking at price differentials that in some of those months were not small, as much as 30 cents or so on a monthly basis difference between where prices were if we had a normal seasonal price pattern as opposed to where they were. The average for all those months, some higher, some lower, came in at about, at least by my own calculations, about 17 cents a bushel difference. In average, if you weight them by sales, the typical sales that happen during a marketing year, then you'd be looking at something closer to 7 to 10 cents. The question you have when you start looking at weighting that is, well, did Kansas farmers, in light of the prices they have, sell at a normal rate, or did they hold their grain for later on? Especially if they held grain because of cash flow needs, got into March, April, and then sold it, the impact would be more acute on them of basically a non-seasonal price rise year than otherwise. So you ask the questions, well, what factors were in the market affecting prices? Well, one of them without question was a relatively strong crop down in South America for corn. So that would be a non-U.S.-China issue. But as witnessed by the market's record bearish positions for managed money traders, basically spec traders, that occurred especially as you had headed off into March and April. A lot of those markets on a daily basis were, as we read the market reports anyway, were affected seemingly by U.S.-China trade negotiation challenges. So you bring that into account, and I think it's fair to say that at least some, or a fair amount of what didn't happen in terms of seasonal price rise in the grain markets, and the corn market in particular, had to do with trade tensions. Mm-hmm. So with that, you start looking for a number that makes sense. And here you've got research out of Iowa State saying 13 to 21 cents, out of Illinois saying about 8 cents. Things that we were working on that I can see in the market, you're closer to 17, 18 cents, thereabouts, really not far at all off of what the Iowa State numbers were. Mm-hmm. So, when policymakers come together and try to make decisions on what they'll provide for support for farmers, then I think those type of numbers can be of help to them.
Dan, there is this dynamic situation in play, though, right now, with the unknown of what level of aid will be forthcoming from the next rendition, if you will, of the market facilitation program, if that comes to pass, whether it will be higher for corn or it will be higher for soybeans. Meantime, you have producers who either have not planted either crop or have planted and may be looking at replanting because of uncooperative weather. So growers in that situation may well be trying to figure out at this moment which way to go to capture the higher market facilitation program payout, if that's how this all shakes out.
I think it's safe to say this is an outlier year. This isn't anything near normal in terms of our normal planting progress, and of course there's rain forecasts. I think this is what's gotten the attention of the corn futures market in the last several days. That hey, we're behind on progress, and you see the rain forecasts that are projected for the coming several days, and if you only see 5 inches of rain forecast, that's on the low side of what the amounts are, right through this same area. South Dakota, 3-4 inches forecast. Illinois running on the low side, 4.7 inches, but a lot of them 9-10 inches. Indiana, 5 on the low side to the south, but everything northern 2/3, 7-8 inches. Ohio. Well, you're just bemoaning the issue. The point is that a lot of rain coming, and enough rain that we're raising a lot of questions about replanting, about the impacts of late planted corn from excessive moisture. Well, just being late planted to begin with, but excessive moisture on these crops. And now, with this much rainfall coming, you wonder about soybean plantings as well. So we can sit there and bemoan all of that, but really, what do we do about this going forward? It's hard for farmers in their normal hedging mode to be doing a lot of forward pricing when if they don't have the crop planted, they're not sure what bushels they'll have in the cash market to actually make it a hedge. That's certainly something. I think one thing that we did have come about this year was in February when the corn and soybean futures markets were really struggling. We had a relatively low planting price. Well, with what we're seeing now on the crop insurance side, by the time we get to October, if we have cutbacks like we're looking at here, you would expect that the October averages for D19 corn, NOV 19 soybeans will be appreciably higher than the planting prices, and that would be, for the sake of farmers that are in these affected areas, that'd be a real blessing for them, to see the revenue-based crop insurance payments come in on the high side and help to bridge the gap to the next year.
Yeah. All of this under consideration, then, you have put together your price projections on corn based on 3 different scenarios. And to round this off, you might walk through those scenarios and the price estimations that you came up with.
Yeah, the USDA's first out the gate projection in the May WASDE, which was on May the 10th, was for basically 93 million acres of corn being planted, yields of 176.4 bushels per acre, and then they ran that through a balance sheet, ended up with almost 2.5 billion bushels ending stocks to use almost 17%, prices at $3.30. I think that the chances of that actually occurring, especially those acres, way less than 50%. Probably the judicious thing at this point, and some would think that that's probably even too conservative, is to say that, well, what if we only get the amount of acres we planted last year actually done? Well, that'd take us down just about 3.8 million. You'd be down to about 89 million acres planted. If you get the same yield, 176.4 with moisture, et cetera, great, let's say conditions turn great and everything, just that alone, if we just planted last year's acres, everything else pretty much the same, you'd be down below 2 billion to about 1.9, 12.8 stocks to use, about 360. But really, with what we're seeing here now, you're probably all that much more having to consider acreage instead of 93, more like 86, and yields that really is going to be 176 bushel per acre, or is it going to be 170? Both of those scenarios, if you actually have, say, more like 6.5 million less acres planted, season average corn prices for next year, in essence, if they follow the same type of market relationships we've had in the past, it's from $4 to $4.50 corn. But it's not necessarily anything to rejoice about when we're having so much difficulty even getting the crops planted. You just wonder with this combination of circumstances how we'll play out in the next 30 days in terms of having crops in and where prices will go if we don't.
For our corn growers out there, to put it this way, these are interesting times. Dan, thanks for the input. We'll catch up with you here in studio again next week.
Take care, Eric. We'll see you.
Dan O'Brien with us, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Agriculture Today continues after this over the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today, and with more thoughts on getting these corn and soybean stands off and running in Kansas. It has been a struggle for way too many producers yet, and maybe even to the point where replanting decisions would be in order. We'll take up all of this now with crop production and cropping systems specialist Ignacio Ciampitti, K-State Research and Extension. Since we talked last, a couple of weeks back, we have had something of a break in the weather. Still, though, there are delays, there are complications associated with getting both of these crops in. Ignacio.
Yeah, as always, thanks, Eric, for the invitation. And it makes sense, right, that we do this radio interview and now the conditions improve. So Let's keep doing this.
Right.
I would say if you look at the last weeks, and previous weeks in terms of water balance across the state, we are in a very good situation. We have, soils fully recharged. We have probably excellent conditions to carry the crop, in many situations until flowering with not really a lot of problem. And main issues that we are facing today is to basically plant the crop. That's one of the main challenges, and I think that we need to tackle this in multiple ways. From one side, those guys that they planted too early, right? Those guys that they were mid-April, early April, today they are facing the problem that temperatures were not high as expected for this time of the year. The growing degree units and the heat units of that crop, were not as expected. So that is impacting the crop in the sense that the crop is responding to two factors today, is temperature and water. If temperature is below optimal, so that crop is growing really small.
We're talking corn now.
We're talking about corn, yes, exactly. Soybeans, we will get into this. So corn, last Monday, I mean, we were around 46%, so we are around 20% behind the normal. When you look at all the states, we're in a pretty good shape.
Right.
All the states surrounding us, they are really below, I mean, for multiple situations. We were able to implant the crop early in the season, and then we were able to start working in this window of time between rains. The crop that has been already planted, as I mentioned before, is growing quite slow. And then the second problem that we are facing at this moment is some of the corn in the low areas has been underwater. Corn with 24, 48 hours underwater. So to keep it quite simple, when the crop is underwater, I mean, the roots don't have oxygen, so the diffusion of oxygen is 1 of 10,000. It's very small in the water, and then those roots are not respiring. Like any human, when you don't respire, so the crop is basically losing functionality. And then what we'll start seeing after the water recedes is, in some situations, those plants that were with maybe more than 48 hours underwater maybe dying, turning brown and start dying. So for our farmers, we need to start looking at those fields based on the average of number of plants and mortality. I mean, replanting could be a solution. Based on the price of the crop, we really need to be careful about taking that decision. And I think that we need to start looking at what is a pattern. Is a uniform, was just in one section of the field, several acres, or if the pattern is not uniform, in many situations, if we have less than 20 or 30% of plants that are out, it's just better to keep the crop going based on corn prices, seed price today, and looking at expectation. I think that we are basically crunching time, and the most important part will be for our farmers to concentrate and may focus on the new planting areas and keep making progress, because we have at least a couple of weeks ahead that they will be also wet. So I think that today, I have seen not that many farmers discussing yet on replanting.
Yet. Even if a corn plant survives being submerged for an extended time, its performance is going to be hampered some regardless, is it not?
Yes, and it depends. I mean, when some studies were showing, yield reductions, depending on the timing, from 10% all the way to 30%. They seem pretty small reductions, but plants are not functionally growing. They're using the reserves, and everything will depend on how many days total, those plants are underwater. In some situations, if the plants were for more than 3 or 4 days underwater, we will be losing those plants. And the other point to emphasize today is that susceptibility to the crop to be underwater also changes when it's growing. So the small plants are quite susceptible because, our growing point is still below the ground. The larger plants, when you are moving to plants that they have 4 or 5 leaves, are less susceptible because you have the growing point above the ground. So far, we have very slow emergence. Because one thing is to say that we are only 20% behind on planting at the state level. But if you look at the numbers of emergence, far behind. And I think that I tell this to many farmers this year, don't expect too much difference for something that you planted first, second week of April, if you plant it so early, versus something that get planted like last week of May. Priority today is to make sure that you plant your fields. And that's the number one priority. So as soon as you have any time, and it might be in between rains, make sure to go back to those fields that you planted early and try to do some scouting. That will be helping you to assess the level of damage and to start to put some strategy of what is the best fields that you should maybe need to go back right away. Second problem that we will be facing, many farmers already discussed this, is a crop insurance. And in some scenarios, when you are looking at our crop insurance map, we are in May 25th in some places, May 31st.
That's the deadline for
planting. Again, one thing is to emphasize, if you plant it after that deadline, you will not be able to insure the entire crop. So any day that you are passing that deadline, you are losing a point of insuring your crop. But I will say, still, I think that farmers should be emphasizing planting the seed in the right soil conditions. At this point of the year and looking at the perspective that we are seeing from the summer, if we are starting with our excellent canopy, I think that we have very good chances to get a good crop.
This is all fraught with complications, but the point is producers need to really sit down and think through what they have and what they can do from here to improve their situation, which may not come clear immediately, but monitoring it is very important. What about soybeans, Ignacio? Again, comparatively few acres have been planted in Kansas so far, and there's still a window of time to get this done if the weather cooperates.
On soybeans, for sure, our planting window is even much broader. When you're looking at many of our planting day studies, soybeans planted in many situations, even mid-June, have been yielding, 50, 60, 70 bushels, in some situations. And everything will depend on what will be basically the conditions when we get until the close to mid-August, September, which is the moment that the soybeans is setting the pods and start basically at the end of the season looking at filling those seeds. And that is probably one of the big factors changing the yield potential for soybeans. And as mentioned before, we still have time. Having heard a lot of people this year planting first soybeans, then corn, rationale behind that, maybe because, and I'm hoping that they're following this idea, we want to plant the corn in the best situation possible, but at the same time they're planting the soybeans to make sure that they get something on the ground. So and they're putting more priority on the corn to make sure that the corn has better uniformity on plants coming up early in the season, having a good canopy architecture, like plants, with a good distance. For some of those guys that they were early on planting soybeans and the soybeans are out there, situation is quite similar. Soybeans are susceptible to water.
Right.
And if it's water standing in the field for 24, 48 hours, we start also having issues. In the next growth stages, when soybeans is reaching the B1, B2 stage, is the moment that soybeans start establishing this association with bacteria. And the bacteria is a rhizobia that is helping those soybeans to fix nitrogen and provide the nitrogen to the plant. That could be even a bigger complication, because if we are in that stage for those soybeans that were planted too early and we have high temperature or flooding conditions, any conditions like produce some stress on the plant, it will impact in the ability of that plant to establish that symbiosis. That can produce a whole different level of problems, because the amount of nitrogen that bacteria provides to soybeans is very large. Sometimes we are talking about 200 or 300 pounds of nitrogen. And then we will be getting into a big trouble of trying to see how we can rescue those soybeans, which usually you will not see the problem until it's too late, many situations, around August.
So soybeans, when you come back to the thought of replanting, might be a more viable candidate because we have a larger window of planting normally anyway. Plus, if you have to throw money at providing added nitrogen to soybeans, that becomes economically impractical. So maybe replanting is a better alternative.
Yeah, and I completely agree on all the statements. I would say that I'm not looking, and most of our research is not showing big benefits on putting nitrogen to soybeans. So I don't think that is something that people should be looking at this point, unless they are really trying to maximize yields, looking at 80, 90 bushels, and they have a research curiosity. But soybeans has, as we discussed before, this very broad window, so replanting for going back to any field, soybeans is a much better candidate. The only issue is that we need to be careful with the herbicide applications. Whatever was going into corn might have a negative effect. Herbicides, if you want to now switch to soybeans.
Just a few things for our growers to sift through here in the days and weeks ahead, as this planting season for corn and beans anything but smooth so far here in Kansas. Ignacio will welcome you back for more discussion on the state of those crops early on as we move forward. Many thanks for the update.
Yeah, thanks.
Ignacio Ciampitti with us, crop production, cropping systems specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Agriculture Today returns shortly on this, the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and on we go now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. And for a change of pace, some good news on the agricultural trade front. The European Union Commission has canceled an ethanol anti-dumping duty against imports from the U.S. that's been in place since 2013, essentially reopening a market that had collapsed. The Commission made that announcement on Tuesday after launching a review of the duty in February of last year. The Commission concluded that removing the duty would not increase the likelihood of dumping of U.S. ethanol on the EU market. The 9.5% duty was put in place as a result of a complaint filed by the EU's largest ethanol producer group. In addition, the Commission said it did not find evidence that U.S. ethanol exports have increased because of a lack of growing domestic demand, nor because of growing demand in other countries. Now, according to data from the U.S. Census Bureau, USDA, and U.S. Department of Commerce, ethanol exports from the U.S. to the European Union stood at about 175 million gallons in 2012. After the EU implemented the anti-dumping duty on U.S. imports, exports collapsed to around 25 million gallons in 2013, and those fell to near zero by 2016. U.S. exports to Brazil made up for the loss of the EU market, however, growing from about 50 million gallons in 13 to 450 million in 2016. Because U.S. ethanol plants produce about 2.8 gallons per bushel of corn, export market restoration in the EU to 2012 levels would create a demand for about 62.5 million bushels of corn, or less than 1% of all corn produced in the U.S. Still, the decision was met with encouragement from U.S. ethanol and agriculture interest groups. It's been about a year and a half since leaders from the U.S., Mexico, and Canada signed the USMCA trade deal. It still has not been approved by lawmakers in any of the three countries. The USDA's Gary Crawford offers this status report.
In separate sessions with visiting farm broadcasters at USDA this week, two top ag trade leaders started humorously with the same basic understatement.
You know, there are just a couple things going on in agricultural trade these days. Very quiet on that front.
Yeah, right. The voices of Chief U.S. Ag Trade Negotiator Greg Dowd and USDA's Trade Undersecretary Ted McKinney talking about possible trade deals with several countries, but also one deal that's already signed, the one with Mexico and Canada, but it needs the legislatures of all three countries to ratify it. And Greg Dowd says on that score, there's a big issue in the way.
The steel and aluminum 232 tariffs.
Many people expected the U.S. would cancel those tariffs when the USMCA was signed a year and a half ago, but that didn't happen. And Greg Dowd says
there's conversation just about every day with Mexico and with Canada on how to resolve this.
Meanwhile, some U.S. lawmakers are calling for changes in the agreement before they vote for it, but USDA's Ted McKinney says,
I don't see major changes. I don't think our partners to the north and south are going to go for that.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And as we mentioned briefly yesterday here, local Farm Service Agency offices are scheduled to accept applications for continuous Conservation Reserve Program sign-up starting June the 3rd. The USDA's Rod Bain has further details.
USDA's Farm Service Agency announced Wednesday they would accept applications for a continuous Conservation Reserve Program sign-up and offer extensions for some expiring CRP contracts. FSA Administrator Richard Fordyce told the House Agriculture Subcommittee sign-up begins June 3rd, the first continuous CRP sign-up since the 2014 Farm Bill Authority expired, and prioritizes water quality conservation practices.
Conservation buffers like riparian buffers and contour grass strips are often needed to prevent sediment and nutrients from polluting water bodies.
And while work continues to develop regulations related to CRP under the 2018 Farm Bill, Fordyce added,
after thorough analysis, FSA has determined that CRP continuous and CREP sign-ups may be opened under limited circumstances prior to publication of the regulation.
FSA also continues developing rental rates and the publishing of regulations for a general CRP sign-up scheduled to take place this December. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Now, this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop with Marcia Boswell. Marcia?
Many areas of Kansas have received favorable weather conditions for the development of stripe rust and leaf rust on the wheat crop. Farmers should be scouting their fields to look for signs of these diseases. The wheat crop in central Kansas is now moving through the flag leaf emergence and flowering stages of growth. The crop is most advanced in the southeast and south central region, where many fields are either flowering or already in the early stages of grain development. Wheat in the north central and northwestern regions generally ranges from late jointing to flag leaf emergence. These growth stages are critical for many wheat diseases and management decisions. According to K-State Research and Extension plant pathologist Eric DeWolf, the weather was very conducive for the development of stripe rust and leaf rust over the past 2 weeks. Many regions of the state have experienced frequent rainfall and extended periods of high relative humidity that favor disease development. DeWolf says that farmers need to frequently check their fields for signs of these diseases. Taking precautions would be ideal for most people at this point. Fungicides are the best precautionary measure to take. Farmers should be evaluating where they stand economically and see if spraying fungicide is in their best interest. Not taking these precautions and scouting your fields can greatly affect yield. Yield loss is not ideal for any farmer, and these diseases can cause major damage if they are not properly handled. According to DeWolf, the South Central region was the first to report rust diseases on their wheat crop. This area is a hot spot for these diseases to thrive, with all of the precipitation they have had. There have been reports of the diseases spotted in other areas other than the South Central region, but they have not been as prevalent in those areas. The precipitation the entire state has received is creating the ideal breeding grounds for rust diseases. While fungicides are a great way to prevent these diseases from spreading, they can still appear even after spraying. There are also indications that genetic resistance of some important wheat varieties is not as effective this season. DeWolf says a genetically resistant crop would be ideal for these types of situations, but we just have not developed one yet. Until a genetically resistant crop has been developed, farmers will have to deal with these diseases the old-fashioned way. The hope is that in the near future, there will be a variety that is genetically resistant to these diseases, and this will be one less obstacle farmers have to face. It is important that growers continue to scout fields for signs of disease. Fields with stripe rust or leaf rust established in the upper leaves during the heading or flowering stages of growth are at a high risk for yield loss. Fields with low levels of disease in the mid or lower canopy are at a moderate risk. K-State Research and Extension has multiple publications to help growers identify disease, evaluate the need for fungicides, and select the appropriate fungicide products. Links to these publications can be found at kswheat.com. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. And this is Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. This is Agriculture Today, and to close out our Friday edition, it's our visit with K-State Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather. Mary is actually, as we speak, in Estes Park, Colorado, meeting with weather colleagues. Mary, you might tell more about what this gathering is all about before we go any further.
This is part of a multi-state project with the Western Governors Association, where we're looking at volunteer monitoring networks of various stripes. The biggest of which, of course, is our Cocoa Ross network, of which we've been a participant since 2005. Again, we're looking at how the information is being utilized, improvements to the system for people to report, and recruiting and retention of the observers, a number of things like that. And it includes members of the National Weather Service, the various state associations, and even a few observers.
And in fact, if somebody would like to join the Cocoa Ross network, it's a very easy process, Mary.
Right. They can go to the website, cocoaross.org. That's COCORAHS.org. And there's a Join Now button. They ask where you are going to locate the rain gauge, and some information about contact and click that, and we can see about getting a gauge to you. It's easy to report, and very useful for, again, tracking not only on how wet things have been, but also as we go back into our inevitable dry pattern, which being Kansas, we will get that sooner or later, tracking the areas that didn't get the rain, and that happens. Radar rainfall estimates are not always the best, and the CoCoRaHS data is very useful in helping to determine where those holes are in the coverage.
So look into that, and as a matter of fact, Mary, CoCoRaHS participants may be quite busy in the days ahead here in Kansas. We will be talking about that briefly. The recap of this past week, well, it may not show up in the official records because they end as of this past Tuesday, but we hit a heat stretch the last couple of days.
Right. We have had some temperatures in the 90s in the last couple of days. When we look at the weekly total that feeds into the U.S. Drought Monitor, that weekend on Tuesday, we did have some temperatures in the upper 80s at the end of the period. These are Tuesday's highs on the 87, 88 degree range, giving us a kind of a hint of what was coming in the rest of the week. But we had lows in the 30s. We dropped down to 31, below freezing, and actually many of the divisions, the Northeast missed it. Our low was 37, as did the South Central and Southeast. But Northwest, North Central, West Central, all down in the 30s. Fortunately, most of the wheat in that area is not as far advanced as in the rest of the state, and the cold temperatures did not persist for very long, so hopefully not much of that wheat was damaged by those cold temperatures.
And looking back at the rainfall totals this past week, well, again, the last few days have been relatively dry, suitable for field work, but that's not the whole story as we look back over the last several days.
Right. As we start that period with May 8th, that has been the wettest day so far in May. According to our CoCoRaHS data, we had 701 observers report that day on the CoCoRaHS network, and the average statewide amounts reported were 1.76 inches. Again, not everybody got heavy amounts, but it was a fairly widespread event. Now, as we moved later into the week, we had pop-up showers across the area, and the amounts were significantly less, tapering off a little bit in anticipation of the weekend storms and the rainfall into next week.
And earlier in the broadcast, Dan O'Brien alluded to this, some substantial rainfall in store for parts of Kansas and further east.
Right. When we look at the quantitative precip forecast, which is the measure of not just the possibility of rain, but how much rain might come with the system, we're looking at substantial numbers, and a good portion of the heaviest rainfall amounts are expected to go right across south central Kansas up into eastern Kansas, into Iowa and Minnesota, and the amounts that they're talking about go as high as 5 to 7 inches, with a fairly large band in that 4 to 5 inch range. As we move into central Kansas, say the Hayes area, the amounts drop off a little bit. We're talking 1.5 to 2 inches, but still fairly significant amounts. This time it looks like the moisture is going to make its way up into north central Kansas, which has missed out a little bit more on the rain than other parts of the central and eastern regions of the state.
So an active pattern ahead, and that starts this weekend. Next week, will there be any sort of a break?
At this point, it's not encouraging. When we look at the climate predictions 6 to 10 day outlook, the precipitation continues to favor wetter than normal. The strongest signal in Kansas is in the western parts of the state, but you have to go all the way to the southeast to get a pattern of drier than normal in the outlook. If we go out to the 8 to 14-day outlook, again, it continues with a moderate signal for wetter than normal across much of the state.
And before we go, just noting to folks as this weather rolls in this weekend, stay alert for any severe weather possibilities that might stem from the system that will be passing through, especially with all the graduation activities and otherwise going on.
And remember that severe weather not only is the tornado hail event, but with the saturated grounds and the expected rainfall amounts, flooding will be a distinct possibility, and maybe in areas that aren't normally noted for flooding.
Mm-hmm. Mary, good travels back from Colorado. Thanks for the update right here.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp with us, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension. And thanks to you as well for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.